Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's Peter here, Peter Cleary from Santis Health. Since it's 10 on the nose and we want to get rolling. And I just want to introduce our firm, our team very quickly who are on this call, presenting you guys some numbers and our insights on those numbers and what that might mean for healthcare. So at a very high level, if you don't already may already, we are a consultancy firm that focuses specifically on healthcare and life sciences, providing a range of services, which you can see here from public affairs advice to public policy to marketing and communications. And we all come from different walks of life in the healthcare sector in our firm, be it in embedded right in the health sector, or some of us who have a political life prior to joining our consultancy. And today on this call, we want to make sure there's time for questions. So to do so, how you can raise your hand, it's fairly simple at the bottom of the screen. You just and I can manually engage. But on the call today, it's myself. Have a couple of years of experience working in the federal government under Justin Trudeau. Prior to that, I worked in Ontario for the health minister under the Kathleen Wynne and Dalton McGuinty. Mara is joining us as well too. Joanne has a stellar history in government. She was the deputy chief Harper, and she worked in both the minority and majority governments of the federal conservative government here. Who's going to kick things off in a second here. Who experienced for the health minister in Ontario. High level, we want to walk through some of the most recent polling numbers, give you some thoughts of what it might mean, where things are trending, and then do a bit of a deeper dive on the health policies of the where they stand and try and read into where we think this beast of an election is going. So with that, turning it over to Ian.
Thanks, Peter. So to set some context first, of course, looking back at the last two previous federal elections. So in the 2011 election, of course, the Conservatives received a majority. The Liberals were decimated down to a small third-party status, and the NDP, we saw a sweep across Canada and particularly in Quebec. In the 2015 election, the Liberals rebounded, of course, formed government, a majority. Conservatives ended up back in opposition, and the NDP went back to third party. But a key piece of this is kind of we're going through to keep in the back of your turnout, because this is something that the polls, of course, do not pick up. It's largely an unknown up until the election day. And in 2015, we saw a really high voter turnout, particularly among the millennial population, that 18 to 34 age group. And so our key question going into this election is, will voter turnout be strong? Will it be low? And particularly, how will that millennial group vote, which is really why you're seeing a lot of the parties trying to pander to that age group. So to go over some polling at a national level based on the popular vote. So these numbers are all based off of the CBC aggregate polling, but we've put these in the graph format for you. So it's a little bit easier to kind of analyze and get some insights through. But really the main takeaway here is that the numbers really haven't moved that much throughout the course of this campaign. There have been some movement more recently, specifically among the Bloc Québécois and the NDP, but particularly among the two, the main parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, there really hasn't been that much movement. And to look at things a little bit by regional breakdown, starting from the West Coast and moving east. But it's really through all the regional polls here, a key piece is that the Liberals are really down everywhere since 2015. But of course, there's been some significant gains from the Conservatives, and the NDP have really continued more on a downward trajectory, and that's really reflected through here. So going across from British Columbia, it's obviously a tight race for the Liberals and Conservatives, but there's significant support among the other parties, and the Conservatives have a significant advantage currently in Alberta and the Prairies. In Ontario, this of course has been a key battleground for the election, a big focus. the Liberals are ahead but not by very much, and that's really where it's going to come down to how those ridings, particularly in the 905 region around the GTA, shake out. In Quebec, with the decline of the NDP, it's looking like most of those seats are either going to go currently to the Liberals of the Bloc Québécois, and so the popular vote in that region really reflects that currently. In Atlantic Canada, the Liberals, of course, currently have all the seats in Atlantic Canada, but there's been they are in the lead, relatively comfortable, but there has been growth, particularly among the NDP and the Green Party. Of course, in a first past the post system, it's really about voter efficiency at the end of the day, and riding count. And right now, it's really impossible to predict what's going to happen at this stage. Ever since the Trudeau's blackface scandal revelations, they've really kind of continued to sit in the minority government territory, with the Liberals in a slight lead in a minority government. Prior to that, they were more on a comfortable track potentially towards a majority, but this is where things sit right now. But it's so close and neck at this stage. But of course, ultimately, elections are a referendum on the leader, and that's really what, in many cases, the question comes down to. Traditionally, when you see a leader maintaining and gaining steady popularity, that's of course reflected in questions around preferred prime minister, and then in polling at the regional level that really follows suit. We're not really seeing that in this election. Things are rather static. The Liberals are consistently in the lead, of course, but it's been rather volatile, particularly over the last few weeks since that scandal emerged. And it's interesting in that, of course, when the Greens start to go up, then Trudeau's leadership numbers start to go down, and we're also starting to see a bit of a slight growth in NDP support. And that is really a key piece that could mean the difference between a Liberal minority or the Liberals even able to form government at all. And another piece of this to keep in mind are leader impressions, and Abacus data has some really good information on this. And really what the key piece of this slide is as you can see, neither leader of either the Liberals or Conservatives have really had any sort of strong positive perception among the electorate in this campaign. Both leaders are really tracking more in a negative perception category. And I think that speaks to the kind of election we've seen, which of course has been focused mostly on personal attacks and mudslinging to date. So going in a little more narrow on the regional or local level. So of course, the key battlegrounds in this province are Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. That's not out of the norm. Of course, those provinces have the most ridings, so they are the most competitive. But these are ultimately the provinces that will be critical in determining who is able to be successful. But what's really important to keep in mind is in 2015, the Liberals won ridings in these provinces in many instances by a very small margin, in many cases less than 2%. And that's where local efforts will be really determine the outcome. So in terms of key ridings to focus on, there's really 60 ridings that are predicted to really be to shape the entire election at the national level, and these slides here break them down into 6 themes. So there are, of course, those ridings that are telling of the collapse in NDP support outside of Quebec. So these are ridings that traditionally have been NDP strongholds in past elections, and so the question now is whether these will return back to NDP support, or the NDP will be able to maintain the support they have in those ridings. There's the key ridings that are really telling of the fight between Conservative and Liberal outside of the GTA. And again, speaking to that earlier point, these are many ridings where the Liberals in 2015 won by a very small margin in some cases. And then, of course, Quebec, with the decline of the NDP, it's now looking like most of those seats will either go to the Liberals or the Bloc Québécois. But it will be interesting to see how that race shakes out. And in Ontario, of course, a key piece of the Liberal strategy to date has been to focus on the unpopularity of Doug Ford and to attack the provincial leader. And so it will be interesting to see if that strategy is effective. And these are some of the ridings where that strategy may or may not work, depending on what ultimately happens on election day in the GTA region. On pipelines, Liberals are really the only losers on that topic. They're either, people mostly criticize them for either not moving fast enough or moving forward at all. And there are key ridings, of course, in the British Columbia and Alberta provinces, which will be telling of that election issue. And then, of course, there are a handful of ridings where there's a rejection of the two traditional main parties, the Liberals and Conservatives, and it will be telling to see whether some of these ridings say swing over to the Green Party, or even if there are some elected independent members of Parliament. So ultimately, especially in this election, ground game does matter. Generally speaking, consensus among political scientists is that local efforts really only account for tipping 3 to 5% of the overall vote in a riding, so not by much. But that 3 to 5%, of course, can go a long way in a race such as this one that is really just stuck in deadlock and has a high rate of undecided voters currently. But it's important to keep in mind that only the Liberals and the Conservatives really have strong ground game, and that's largely because they have the strong fundraising base and resources to support it. And of course, the Liberal majority in 2015, again, in a lot of these ridings was won by under 2% of the vote. So those local efforts can make the difference, whether they're able to hold on to those ridings or whether the Conservatives are able to take those ridings. And there's some examples here from past elections that really highlight how close things can get. So now we're going to move on to going over some of the Liberal and Conservative campaigns. I'm going to turn it back to my colleague, Peter.
Thanks, Ian. So I think we'll do a quick little deep dive on where the Liberal Party has focused their efforts to date, and then touch on specifically what they've been promising or recommitting when it comes to healthcare. So the Liberals went into this campaign knowing that it would be a slug of a fight. They, of course, challenged by the SNC-Lavalin situation, scandal, however you want to define that. They had to fan out over the summer, leverage the fact that they were in the government, use that to their benefit, and they announced a significant amount of funding over the summer across the country. There's a couple stories about that recently in terms of how much money went out the door in the last couple months, which is completely unsurprising when you're in the position of government going into an election. Pretty much every government will take advantage of that situation. So that speaks to how they were trying to be smarter on their communications tactics to change the channel from what it had once been. But they're also trying to be, they're trying to identify themselves for Canadians as not just being the party that has progressive policies, but progressive policies that are doable. They're fighting the NDP and the Green Party simultaneously, be it on climate change and the environment, as well as on some other issues like healthcare, for instance, where they want to be seen as the more realistic, as having the most realistic policies that could be implementable. At the same time, they have been working on establishing wedge issues, which for the first week or so of the campaign was going quite well for them until photos emerged of Justin Trudeau wearing blackface from his 20s. So that definitely put a wrinkle in what I would imagine was the Liberal War Room's plan to frame Andrew Scheer as being a person that is not supportive of social policies. Having said that, that still has had an impact, especially on Andrew Scheer in Quebec and others. Not to take away from Joanne Slender, who will talk about the Conservatives next. And then they've been specifically looking to fight with some provinces and some premiers. And as Ian alluded to, They're more than happy to talk about Doug Ford any day. A day that Doug Ford's in the news cycle is a good day for the Liberals because he has had a very tumultuous first year and a year and a half, I guess now, as premier there. But at the same time, they don't want to fight with some other premiers like the Premier of Quebec. It's not necessarily in their interest, especially when they have a sizable lead in that province. When it comes to healthcare, they have a record to run on. There are a couple things that they would refer to. The government that signed new health accords with provinces and territories. Signed is a loose term. I think we could have a debate whether or not they were imposed or not. But that was specifically on mental health and addictions and home and community care, $6 billion for mental health, $5 billion for home and community care. They were the government that had to respond to the court challenge on medical assistance in dying. Interestingly, which on day one of this campaign was struck down by courts in Quebec. So no matter who forms government, they will again have to go back on that legislation to make it compliant with court ruling. Medical cannabis not only was something this government had to deal with when it came to health, but future governments will as well. After the Allard decision and after the legalization of recreational cannabis, there will be a requirement to review the medical cannabis regime in the next couple of years. Opioids, again, something that this government, any government would have to deal with increasing numbers of deaths related to misuse of opioids or just use of opioids. And last but not least, pharmaceutical drugs, especially for the last year or two of this, the Liberal government's tenure has taken a front page on the health government's agenda. There are some other things as well too, like healthy eating food guide, and there's a couple commitments that they did make on health that they didn't quite get done, front of pack labeling being one of them. But on pharmaceutical, the Patent Medicines Prices Review Board, new regulations being put in place mere weeks before the election started to make an attempt to lower the price of drugs. Whether or not it will have the intended impact will be an interesting debate. The government is banking on them thinking that their information is right, that there will not be an impact on the drugs that will come to market. There is a very alternative point of view put forth that the government is risking by doing this, making Canada a market that is not one that is favorable that has favorable conditions for marketing new drugs in Canada. It's going to be a long-term fight, this one, especially as evidence will need to be put forth on any perspective as to whether or not it's having the intended impact or not. But this leads into pharmacare. This whole debate on pharmacare with this government, Eric Hoskins obviously was tapped in to lead a council to give the government recommendations. The Liberals in their platform have said that they're committed to moving forward with pharmacare. In terms of what form that takes is up for debate. And as recently as 2 days ago, Justin Trudeau in the post-debate scrum said that it's actually not up to the government or any federal entity to decide, but in fact, it's up to provinces and territories to decide. The feds can only put forth options, which is a really interesting perspective because I think there has been a thought that the government would be more aggressive on pharmacare. I think any realistic person who understands FPT relations would see that this is a logical way to pursue this because it's actually up to provinces as to whether or not this would happen. But I think there's a lot of advocates for pharmacare that would be left disappointed with that framing. I think that's what I'm trying to say. They've also set aside money to help increase access to family doctors, which is a huge issue in some areas of Canada where that is a real struggle, especially in Atlantic Canada. They've also indicated that they want to continue with the investments in mental health and addictions, and they also want to establish national standards around mental health, which is something new in the platform. So having kind of given this overview, I'm going to pause here and send it over to Joanne to talk through the Conservatives, and then we'll wrap it up and give some insights. So over to you, Joanne.
Thanks, Peter. So the Conservative campaign that we've seen is focused on three main pillars of affordability, trust, and competence is what their winning strategy is. You'll hear them talking about Canadians who work hard and play by the rules and struggle to get by, and talking about making life more affordable and putting money in the pockets of Canadians. That is their path, what they see as their path to victory. So to this, you'll see them talk about Liberal scandals, which go to this competence and trust issues. They traditionally have a very strong base of support. Their sort of part Conservatives is more likely to actually get out and vote. They have an advantage whether they've been in the lead over the last 4 years, well, probably longer than that, but even since the Trudeau government in 2015, they still out fundraise. They raise smaller amounts of money from a greater number of people. And you'll see them focusing on vote-rich suburbia. So you won't see Andrew Scheer in downtown Toronto. You will see him in again, as Ian indicated, out in the 905 and out in areas outside of Vancouver and outside of Halifax and outside of the larger centers. You'll see them focusing on suburbia and on suburban issues. As far as health goes, they don't have a record, having not been in government. So their commitments in this area are slightly different. The Conservative viewpoint generally is one of respecting the provinces. You saw this throughout Stephen Harper's tenure as Prime Minister, when he also imposed the health accords, though didn't even pretend to not do that. You'll see that the Conservatives and what we think the Conservatives will do will maintain that posture going forward, where they, if they do make commitments, they will very rarely tie them to things. It will be the provinces can make their own decisions, and respecting sort of the jurisdictional nature of the Constitution. So they will believe that healthcare belongs to the provinces. They have committed to maintaining the health transfers, which is the current government commitment and was also the commitment of the former Conservative government pre-2015. They haven't put out their platform yet, so we're not sure if there's more health specific. If there is, we would think it would not be in large sweeping programs like pharmacare, but in more targeted things. So we saw them announce a funding commitment for $1.5 billion for diagnostic imaging equipment. This plays to their sort of strategy of suburbia and of what people are worried about in those type of areas, particularly in Ontario, where there's a lot of focus on hallway healthcare and wait times for testing. And this goes to that, trying to bring those people on board and see that the Conservatives care about these issues as well. So I would probably end there on their focus on health, and I'll touch a little bit on the other parties and what they're saying. So we're seeing from the NDP sort of the diametric opposite of the Conservatives. So they would be more, they tend to, their platform tends to read more local, so more what a provincial government would do. So they will include things like dental care and pharmacare, and you saw earlier on in the campaign, the NDP leader announcing funding for a local hospital in Brampton. So it will be more, what their commitments will be more on a local level and more tied to federal funding being tied to provincial funding. For the Greens in this election, it's probably, their platform is probably the first time they have realized that they need to talk about more than the environment and climate change, and so their platform this time is more reflective of other policy priorities. So they highlight things in healthcare, they highlight things like pharmacare, and then you have the Bloc where they have not changed their traditional alignment, and they will focus on the government's role in providing funding for all things health, and obviously increasing that funding for the needs of Quebecers, and funding not being tied and taking the money, but not having any commitments to how the government spends it would be their continued posture on this. So key takeaways, there's two obviously possible outcomes, a majority government and a minority government. Should the polls hold to where they are today, which is anyone's guess, as Ian said earlier, but we would expect if an election were held today, that it would be a minority government, whether that, and most likely a Liberal or Conservative minority government, and which way that falls is kind of one thing. Political observers are divided on minority governments and their effectiveness in legislative and policy accomplishments. On the one hand, there's compromise in a minority government, and so they become less divided on the policy side. But on the other side, minorities often become very confrontational. It's very tenuous. They're very short. There's been 7 minority governments over the past 60 years, although 3 of them since the early 2000s. But it tends to be a little more partisan and in nature, because you're sort of always on election or electoral footing and wondering when the next election will happen. So I'll turn to, again, assuming it is a minority government, and we're certainly not 100% sure of that, but it seems likely at this point in time. There's some key challenges and opportunities in a minority government. So in a Liberal minority, it seems likely that depending on the math of the seat count, that other parties would potentially support them. So the NDP potentially, or the Greens potentially. There's not a lot of talk in this election, interestingly, that there was in the last 2 federal elections about there being a coalition and what that means. So, and whether a coalition could possibly be a formal coalition where, potentially there would be NDP members or Green Party members of a Liberal government, say sitting in cabinet or in some formal way, or whether it's just sort of in a mutually agreed to, legislation by legislation sort of basis, whether that's an informal coalition. We have heard the NDP, Jagmeet Singh has said that he would not support a Conservative government, but he has not ruled out working with a potential Liberal government. He was asked again in the post-debate scrums the other night whether he would sit formally in a Trudeau government, and he did not rule that out. So it will be interesting to see how that plays. In the case of a Conservative minority, I would say that none of the parties are likely to form a coalition with the Conservatives, just based on their beliefs and where they are. The Conservatives sit on the sort of, they're being given, I would say, the center and the right of the spectrum at this point in time, and the other parties are all fighting on the left. And so we would expect a Conservative minority government to operate similar to the 2 Stephen Harper governments, where they would sort of table budgets and table legislation that they believed in, they thought could pass. They may give passing thought to what other parties would think, and I don't think they'd put poison pills in, but I also don't think they would put anything in that other parties sort of demanded in order to pass. Keeping in mind that coming out of a minority government, I think the Conservatives are the best positioned to fight another election quickly. You'll recall that the NDP are campaigning this time without a plane because they don't have a huge amount of cash on hand. The Liberals also don't have a lot of cash. The cash that Conservatives will be the best positioned. So they would probably be the least worried about going into an election quickly. So this leaves some opportunities for businesses and for others from a policy perspective. I would say that in a minority government, the center has a little bit less control, so ministers have a little bit more control, but also the bureaucracy sort of tightens its grip on things and on policies. This, I think, is an opportunity for stakeholders to continue to deal with people, say, in the Ministry of Health, who would have expertise and background rather than dealing with politicians on some of these issues, which could be an opportunity to get some policy goals accomplished. Short term, but everyone is looking for a win, and so I think stakeholders have a bit of influence to get in and explain why this is a win. I think sweeping policy changes as far as health goes will be a little more challenging in a minority circumstance, but I think they are still possible depending on the numbers. And MPs and parliamentary committees, generally speaking, will be more powerful in a minority situations, and so therefore more open to influence and open to be people who can actually get things done. Ministers and others will spend more time in their ridings, less time in Parliament, less time traveling internationally, more time sort of fundraising and talking to people on the ground and trying to deliver wins. So if your policy delivers wins for Canadians, then I think there's an opportunity to influence MPs in this in that sort of world. And I think stakeholders framing their ideas in terms of those wins will be important. So I'll turn it back over to Peter for some final thoughts, and then we're happy to take questions on this.
Thanks, Joanne. So I think all of this is to say, even though party leaders have been out trying to frame the news cycle every morning with a policy announcement, that's usually how the party leaders start their day, this campaign really has been about different stories, and it has not motivated the vote in particular. You know, whether it's Justin Trudeau, his blackface scandal, his second plane, which maybe he just stole the NDP plane since they don't have one, whether it's Andrew Scheer, his U.S. citizenship, his insurance broker background being questioned, or him or his candidates being questioned on their position on important social issues. The NDP off to, you know, a rough start, but performing quite well given the circumstances. They went into this campaign with next to no money, and they were very behind on candidates. The leader hadn't actually visited some provinces since taking on the reins of leadership of the NDP. And many previous NDP candidates, some of them provincial, did flip to the Greens, which has really kind of defined this NDP Green fight. And the Greens themselves have not been without their own challenges, especially at the beginning of the campaign. A particularly embarrassing slip up where the spokesperson said that national unity is not of importance to a policy objective or importance to the Green Party, which was just plain silly, as federalism will always be, I think, an important issue in Canada to maintain and defend. So those stories have really driven the narrative of this campaign, and it's kind of resulted in this slog where policy hasn't really broken through, where you're not really debating the parties in between what they will do or won't do. And the leaders' debate just kind of reinforced that. I think a couple of us were talking, and you know, you look at that debate, and it was a bit of a yelling match, and it was hard to actually hear what people are saying when they're talking over each other. They've had little impact. I mean, we're 2 days afterwards, so we'll see where the polls sit after the French leadership debate tonight and after a couple more days of polling. But it doesn't look like there's been a significant change, other than to say that the People's Party, what happens with them will be interesting. Any amount of vote that they go up. It could be argued they're taking from the Conservatives, and if the race is really this tight, and they only go up 1 or 2 points, that could be a real challenging situation for the Conservative Party. And similarly, if the NDP go up a handful of points in specific regions in Ontario and BC or Atlantic Canada or the Greens as well, it could cause trouble for the Liberal campaign. The one thing that kind of comes, affordability is something that I think all the parties recognize is a main concern of Canadians. And it's up to each party how they define or how they will address that affordability question. The sheer Conservatives have a clear plan of tax cuts and tax credits, which is fairly traditionally conservative and reminiscent of what happened under the Stephen Harper government. It speaks to Canadians, and the Liberals are trying to address this angst that Canadians have about affordability by saying, we're going to make sure that you don't have to worry about unexpected costs like costs of prescription drugs, which is why there's that, and enter pharmacare, be it with them or the NDP. And I actually think that the Greens will probably argue that affordability is something that they would find important as well too, just with a bit of an angle that we can't afford not to tackle climate change, and that's something that the NDP, Greens, and Liberals will be fighting for dominance over. But the winner of who will have the best positioning for that will be determined on October 21st. And despite healthcare continually being a top concern for Canadians, it really hasn't profiled that much, and it hasn't really punched through. You saw the NDP and the Greens try and have a healthcare conversation at the debate, and I think it was the Green Party leader that specifically said that there isn't a question on healthcare in that debate, which is interesting. I think the Conservatives said they had like 10,000 or so questions that kind of framed up the debate questions that healthcare would not have punched through. And on healthcare itself, I actually think the differences between the Liberals and Conservatives are actually a little bit nuanced. I think the Liberals want to talk about healthcare more. They want to frame it up more. But when it comes down to brass tacks, the Liberals and Conservatives both recognize that whatever they do has to be done in collaboration with provinces and territories. So that, I think, will impact what a pharmacare regime would look like. And the only thing that I think could significantly change that is if you're in a minority government being supported by the NDP and Greens, which would push the Liberals a lot further to change the goalpost and what pharmacare could look like. All of this is to say, I think we all kind of look at the numbers that sit today. I don't think anybody can truly tell you exactly what's going to happen because, of course, we don't know what's going to happen. October 21st, week and a half away. Anything could happen. I think undecided numbers are still quite high. I think people are still making decisions, slowly firming up in the past week or so for sure. But anything is possible, and I think this election is going to be won or lost on a couple of points going one way or the other. So despite there being the most likely scenario, a minority government with the Liberals having an edge because of their leads in vote-rich Ontario, Quebec, and they don't really lead in BC, but it's a battleground in BC. They're definitely lower there. They do have the easiest path to majority based on where everything sits today, but all of that could very much change, and you could probably flip a coin right now whether or not it's a Conservative or a Liberal minority. I'm gonna pause there, and if you would like to ask a question, all you have to do is go to the bottom of the page, click participants, and click raise hand. We would be happy to take any questions you might have. Alternatively, if there are no questions, and you can do that now while I ramble away here, we do appreciate you joining, and we thought this was kind of fun to do. If you have any feedback or thoughts for us in terms of how we could do this differently, or if there are other things that you would appreciate us talking about, we would be happy to hear about that too and put something together. So I'll pause for a minute if there's any questions. Oh, we got a hand raise. Julie, I'll find you here just a sec. There, you're unmuted. Go ahead. You'd have to unmute yourself now too. There you go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
Excellent. So thank you very much. That was very informative. It brought everything together, which was great. And you know, on a personal level, having 3 university-age students who will be voting this year, I'm thinking, my goodness, I wish they had just been on a little fly on the wall and been able to go through this, because I think they would have found a great deal of interest in it. My question is really about what kind of an impact you think that there is the French language debate that will be occurring, I believe, is it tonight? And I'm wondering, is there any impact at all in the results with that French language debate outside of Quebec? What's your impression?
So I'll throw it to Joanne to kind of talk about how the Conservatives have been impacted in Quebec and the challenge that it's been there for them. But I think based on the narrative this morning, this feels like it's kind of it is the last time you're going to see these leaders together. I think there's a lot of people who are still undecided, and I think there will be a lot of coverage of the debate. And I would argue that the coverage of the debate after the debate is probably more important than the debate itself. How the parties get out there and spin the debate, talk about the debate, do those quick 15, 20-second clips of the debate, put that on Twitter, Facebook, and turn them into social media ads. What the parties do with the debates are becoming more and more important. But how the parties have fared in the French language debate, both TBA last week and what we could expect tonight, is that the Bloc leader, I think, has kind of come up and was maybe even ignored a little bit by all the parties, and has performed very well, and has increased where they're polling at quite a bit. That's impacting the Liberals. I don't think it's impacting them too much, but I think there are some ridings that the Liberals thought they might have a chance in that I think the Bloc are sneaking up the middle. And then I don't know, Joanne, if you have any comments on the Conservative campaign.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think that for the Conservatives have, I think they have 9 or 10 seats where they expect to win in Quebec, and I'm not sure that there's a world where they're going to win sort of 20 to 25 seats, and so they're concerned with protecting their turf, I would say, in Quebec. From the first French language debate, I think it was clear that Scheer wasn't the strongest leader in the French language. For the Conservatives, I think they need to, they will recognize that sort of the rest of Canada who aren't French won't pay attention to this debate. It's debatable whether they paid attention to the English language debate, but they won't pay attention to this one. I think Scheer's came out of, as Peter said, in the sort of post-debate from the last French language debate, came the one Andrew Scheer moment where he revealed that Justin Trudeau, as running on an environmental platform, and then has 2 planes. So I think that dominated any type of coverage coming out. Being able to get a headline that's still a headline for him out of the French language debate was what I think the Conservatives would have viewed as victory in the last debate. So I think tonight it's for the Conservatives. I think it's about not doing any damage outside of Quebec, and trying to get instead of 10 seats up to maybe 15 seats. But I think there's a lot more at stake for Justin Trudeau tonight, or in the French language debate, than there is for Andrew Scheer.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you.
Two other questions came in over text, and whoever decided to do that, super smart, because you can also just write them in. Eric asked, any idea when the Conservatives will release their platform? Joanne, do you want to do this one?
Sure. I don't know the answer to that specifically. I suspect they will put it out sort of closer to election day, but I'm not entirely certain. We saw there's a different strategy for governments, I would say, or people who are incumbent governments. We saw in the 2015 election, the Liberals put their platform out, I think just after the second debate in the 2015 campaign, and the Conservatives came out with it early, and we're seeing the opposite this time. But it's arguably because the Liberals are now in government and the Conservatives are not. But I don't have more information than that.
I think if Ontario taught us anything, you don't necessarily have to release a platform to win either.
Yeah.
And I would argue that it's not like the Conservatives haven't been saying things that they will do. It's whether or not they wrap that up in a polished PDF document and push it out to the world.
Yeah.
Another question came in, and I actually really like this question. Does advanced voting favor a particular party? I'm going to answer that a little bit differently, and then Ian and Joanne, if you have any thoughts. When I'm on a campaign and advanced voting days, I view that as I want to get every single vote in the box as early as possible, because that means if something blows up next week on the campaign, those are locked votes in the box. So it's really handy when you're thinking of running a local campaign that, you know, you're able to slowly reduce the world of people that you're going after throughout the campaign. So, you know, you have your list of people you think that are identified as Green or Bloc or Liberal. You go after them, you find out if they voted, you're confident that they have put that vote in the box. You don't have to worry about them anymore, because if something blows up next week, it's not gonna, at least their votes won't impact you. So it's a bit of a fail-safe. But then it also allows campaigns to focus their efforts and resources for the rest of the campaign on those who haven't voted yet. So it's an efficiency question. Does it favor anybody? I would argue that I think there's probably a bigger question here. If there's a really high turnout, which is what Ian described that we saw in 2015, a high turnout in advanced polls or the general election for any election is usually bad news for the government.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there too and add that I think advanced polls in some, I mean, Joanne can speak to this better than I, but I think advanced polls in some respects could benefit the Conservatives in this election, just in terms of the rather rock solid base that the party has. And those are people who, no matter what, are going to get out and they're going to go and vote Conservative. And so they're likely the base that the party could probably poll at advanced polls, would be my take on it. But Joanne might have another spin as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I would say it favors the Liberals and the Conservatives, I think, because they will have the best ground game. So parties like Maxime Bernier's party will have, I think they will struggle, except for in a few ridings, with having an organized election day and an organized advanced polling sort of perspective. So the stronger ground game you have, I think the better off you are. But I agree with Ian. It's getting your people out. I mean, very few people that know that you can vote already. You can vote at any riding returning office today or any other day. I voted 2 weeks ago, for example. So it's the people who, again, are the Conservative base is definitely motivated, and I see it in a lot of emails and things that I get already of people of the Conservative Party pushing advanced polling. I'm assuming the Liberals are also pushing advanced polling, but it's the getting those votes locked in, and I think the advantage goes slightly to the Conservatives, and then very close behind to the Liberals, and then I think there's a pretty big gap if you don't have a ground game to get that out for the
Nailed it. Are there any other? We'll do a last chance here. If you have a question, type it in there or raise your hand. So we'll give you a second there. Otherwise, we can wrap things up, and genuinely appreciate the time that everybody gave to listen to a couple of political nerds that are in the most exciting time of our lives mid-election. I think that's it. Thanks, Joanne. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining. Have yourself a great day.